Hi. Pippi in the South Seas, Chapter 4. Pippi arranges a question and answer bee. And there's Mr. Nielsen riding on the horse. All right. The long, wonderful summer holiday suddenly came to an end, and Tommy and Annika went back to school. Pippi still considered herself sufficiently well educated without going to school, and announced very decidedly that she had no intention of setting her foot in any school until the day came when she couldn't stand not knowing how the word seasick was spelled. But since I'm never seasick, I don't have to worry about spelling it in the first place, she said. And if I should happen to be seasick one day, then I'll have other things to think about than knowing how to spell it. Besides, you'll probably never get seasick, said Tommy. And he was right. Pippi had sailed far and wide with her father before he became king of a South Sea island, and before Pippi had settled down to live in the Villa Coola. But in all her life, she had never been seasick. Sometimes Pippi would ride over and pick up Tommy and Annika when school was over. This pleased Tommy and Annika very much. They loved to ride on the horse, and there certainly aren't many children who are able to ride home from school on horseback. Please come and pick us up this afternoon, asked Tommy one day, just as he and Annika were going to dash back to school after their lunch hour. Yeah, please, said Annika, because today is the day that Mrs. Rosenblum is going to give out gifts to children who have been good and worked hard. Now, Mrs. Rosenblum was a rich old lady who lived in the little town. She took good care of her money, but once every term she came to the school and distributed gifts to the children. But not all of the children. Oh no, only the very good and hard-working children got the presents. And to make sure she would know which children were really good and hardworking, Ms. Rosenblum held a long examination before she distributed out the presents. That was the reason all the children in town lived in constant dread of her. Every day when they were about to do their homework and were trying to think of something more amusing to do before getting started, their mother or father would say to them, "Remember Miss Rosenblum." It was a terrible disgrace to come home to one's parents and brothers and sisters the day Miss Rosenblum had been to school, and not to have a small coin or a bag of candy, or at least some underwear to show for it. Yes, of all things, underwear, because Miss Rosenblum distributed underwear to the poorest children. But it didn't matter how poor a child was if he didn't know the answer when Mrs. Rosenblum asked how many inches were in a mile. It wasn't surprising at all that the children were afraid of Mrs. Rosenblum. They lived in terror of her soup, too. Believe it or not, Mrs. Rosenblum had all the children weighed and measured in order to see if there were any amongst them who were especially thin and pathetic, who looked as if they weren't getting enough to eat at home. All those who were found to be poor and too skinny had to go to Miss Rosenblum's every lunch hour and eat a big plate of soup. It would have been fine if there hadn't been a whole lot of nasty barley in the soup, It always felt so slippery in their mouths. Now the big day had finally arrived when Mrs. Rosenblum was coming to the school. Classes stopped earlier than usual, and all of the children gathered in the schoolyard. Ms. Rosenblum sat at a big table, which had been placed in the middle of the yard. To help her, she had 2 assistants who wrote down everything about the children: how much they weighed, if they were able to answer questions, if they were poor and needed clothes, if they had good marks to conduct, if they had a younger brother or sister at home who also needed clothing. Oh, there was no end to the things that Miss Rosenblum wanted to know. A box containing coins stood on the table in front of her. There were also a lot of bags of candy and big piles of undershirts and socks and woolen pants. All children, get in a line, get in on the line. Children, in a line, shouted Miss Rosenblum. In the first line, I want children who don't have brothers and sisters at home. Excuse me. In the second line, children who have 1 or 2 brothers and sisters. And in the third line, children who have more than 2 brothers and sisters. This arrangement was made because Miss Rosenblum wanted everything to be orderly. Besides, it was only fair that children who had many brothers and sisters at home should get bigger bags of candy than those who didn't have any siblings at all. Then the examinations began. Oh, how the children trembled with fear. The ones who couldn't answer the minute a question was asked had to go and stand in a corner. And then they were sent home without as much as 1 piece of candy for their little brothers or sisters. Now, both Tommy and Annika were very good at their schoolwork. But in spite of all that, the bow in Annika's hair quivered with suspense as she stood in line beside Tommy. And Tommy's face got whiter and whiter the closer he got to Ms. Rosenblum. When it was his turn to answer, there was a sudden commotion in the line for children without any brothers or sisters. Someone was pushing her way through the crowd, and who should it be but Pippi Longstockings. She brushed the children aside and went straight up to Mrs. Rosenblum. "Excuse me, but I wasn't here when you started," she said. "So which of these lines should I stand, since I don't have 14 brothers or sisters, of which 13 are naughty little boys?" Miss Rosenblum looked very disapproving. "You can stay where you are for the present," she said, "but it seems to me that quite soon you will be moved into that line of children who are going to stand in the corner." The assistant wrote down Pippi's name, and she was weighed in order to find out whether she needed any soup. She weighed 5 pounds too much for that. "You don't get any soup," said Miss Rosenblum. "Sometimes luck's with me," said Pippi. "Now all I have to do is get by without stuck with underwear. Then I'll be able to breathe more freely." Miss Rosenblum paid no attention to Pippi. She was looking through the dictionary for a difficult word for Pippi to spell. And here is a picture. Here's Miss Rosenblum and Pippi. Pippi looks like she's thinking hard, doesn't she? I need to take a sip of my coffee. So when we left off, Miss Rosenblum was looking for a word for Pippi to spell. Now then, she said finally, will you tell me how you spell seasick? I'll be glad to, said Pippi. S-E-E-S-I-K. Miss Rosenblum smiled a sour smile. Is that so? She said, the dictionary spells it differently. Then it was very lucky that you wanted to know how I spell it, said Pippi. S-E-E-S-I-K is the way I have always spelt it, and it seems to have worked out just fine for me. Make a note of that, said Miss Rosenblum to the assistants, and grimly pressed her lips together. Yeah, do that, said Pippi. Make a note of this fine spelling and see it that a change is made in that dictionary as soon as you possibly can. Well, I wonder if you can answer this one, said Miss Rosenblum. When did King Carl XII die? Ooh. Oh dear, is he dead too? Cried Pippi. It's awful how many people die these days. If he had kept his feet dry, I'm sure it would have never happened. Make note of that, said Miss Rosenblum to her assistants in an icy voice. Yeah, by all means, do that too, Pippi said, and make note that it's very good to keep leeches next to the skin, and you should drink a little warm kerosene before going to bed. It's very invigorating. Sounds like she's pulling people's legs, doesn't it? Miss Rosenblum looked desperate. Why does a horse have molars with dark markings running through them? She asked in a stern voice. But are you sure that he has? Said Pippi thoughtfully. You can ask him yourself. He's standing right over there, she said, and pointed to her horse, who was tied to a tree. She laughed contentedly. It's a good old thing I brought him along, she said. Otherwise you would never have known why he has molars with markings in them. Because honestly, I have no idea why. And what's more, I don't care much neither. A narrow line was all that was left of Miss Rosenblum's mouth. This is unbelievable, she mumbled. Absolutely unbelievable. Yeah, I think so too, said Pippi, pleased. If I continue being this clever, I probably won't be able to avoid getting a pair of pink woolen underdrawers. Make note of that, said Miss Rosenblum to the assistants. Nah, don't bother, said Pippi. I really don't care so much about pink woolen underdrawers. That wasn't what I meant. But you could make note of saying, I'm to have a big bag of candy. But I'm going to ask you one more question, said Miss Rosenblum, and her voice sounded as if she was strangling. Yeah, keep it right on coming, said Pippi. I like this kind of question and answer game. Can you answer this one question? Said Miss Rosenblum. Peter and Paul are going to divide a cake. If Peter gets 1/4, what does Paul get? A stomachache, said Pippi. She turned to the assistants. Make note of this, she said seriously. Make note that Paul gets a stomachache. And Miss Rosenblum was finished with Pippi. Why, you are the most rude and disagreeable child I have ever seen, she said. Go over and immediately stand in that corner. Well, Pippi obediently trotted off, muttering angrily to herself. It's unfair because I answered every question. When she had walked a few steps, she suddenly thought of something and quickly elbowed her way back to Mrs. Rosenblum. Excuse me, she said, but I forgot to give my chest measurements and my height above sea level. Make note of that, she said to the assistants. Not that I want any of your soup. Far from it. But the books should be in order after all. If you don't go over and stand in the corner immediately, said Mrs. Rosenblum, I know a little girl is going to get a sound spanking. Oh, that poor child, said Pippi. Where is she? Send her to me and I'll defend her. Make note of that. And Pippi went over and stood in the corner with the children who couldn't answer questions. There, the atmosphere was far from happy. Many of the children were sobbing and crying. And the thought of what their parents and their brothers or sisters would say when they came home without at least one coin and without any candy. Pippi looked around at the crying children and swallowed hard several times. And then she said, We'll have a question and answer bee all our own. The children looked a bit more cheerful, but they didn't quite understand what Pippi meant. I want you to form 2 lines, said Pippi. All of you who know that King Carl XII is dead, stand in one line, and those who still haven't heard that he's dead, stand in the other line. But since all the children knew that Carl XII was dead, there was only one line. Well, that's no good, said Pippi. You have to have at least 2 lines, otherwise it isn't right. Ask Miss Rosenblum, and you'll see. She stopped to think. I have it, she said at last. All very clever and well-trained pranksters will form one line here. And who is to stand in the other line? A little girl who didn't want to be thought of as a prankster asked eagerly. In the other line will put those who are not quite so clever at playing pranks, said Pippi. And over at Mrs. Rosenblum's table, the questioning was continuing full force, and now and then a child on the verge of tears came shuffling over to Pippi's crowd. And listen here, now here comes the hard part, said Pippi. Now we're going to see if you've been doing your homework. She turned to a skinny little boy in a blue shirt. You over there, give me the name of someone who's dead. The boy looked a little surprised, and then he said, Old Mrs. Peterson on number 57. What do you know? Said Pippi. Do you know anybody else? No, the boy didn't. Then Pippi put her hands in front of her mouth in the form of a megaphone and said in a strange whisper, King Carl XII, of course. Then Pippi asked all the children in turn if they knew anyone who was dead, and they all answered, Old Mrs. Peterson in number 57 and King Carl XII. This examination is going better than I expected, said Pippi. Now I'm going to ask only one more thing. If Peter and Paul are gonna divide a cake, and Peter absolutely doesn't want any, but sits himself down in a corner and gnaws on a dry little bit of bread. Who was then forced to sacrifice himself and eat that whole cake? Paul! Shouted all the children. I wonder if children as clever as you could be found anywhere else, said Pippi. But you shall have a reward. From her pocket, she dug out a whole handful of gold coins, and each child got one. Each child also got a huge bag of candy, which Pippi took out of her rucksack. That's a fancy word for a backpack. That is why there was great rejoicing amongst all the children who were supposedly in disgrace. And when Miss Rosenblum's examination was finished and everybody was going home, the children who had been standing in the corner were the quickest to disappear. But first they all had crowded around Pippi Longstocking. Thank you, dear Pippi, they said. Thank you for all the coins and candy. Ah, it's nothing, said Pippi. You don't need to thank me, but you must never forget that I rescued you from the pink woolen underdrawers. That's the end of chapter 4. See you in chapter 5.